the July 13th meeting of the Planning Commission Working Group. And I'd also like to welcome again Ms. Ginny Wertman to the meeting. Ms. Wertman is the Vice Chair of the Community Participation Team and is standing in for Glenn Carter, who was unable to make the meeting today. So on that note, Ms. Rosario, would you take the roll, please?
Yes. Mr. O'Connor?
Here.
Mr. O'Connor is an at-large member. Ms. Leverins?
Here.
Ms. Leverins is also an at-large member. Mr. Haldeman?
Here.
Mr. Haldeman represents the Berkeley District. Mr. Polster? Mr. Polster?
I'm sorry, here.
Mr. Polster represents the Jamestown District. Dr. Rose?
Here.
Dr. Rose represents the Roberts District. Ms. Null?
Here.
Ms. Null represents the Stonehouse District. Mr. Kropp?
Here.
Mr. Kropp represents the Powhatan District and is chair of the Planning Commission. Ms. Wertman?
Here.
Ms. Wertman represents the Community Participation Team. We have
Thank
a
you.
quorum.
Thank you, Ms. Rosario. And just as we go through the meeting, a reminder that we do have the hand raising icon for those that wish to say something. It makes it a little easier so that folks are not talking over one another. Ms. Rosario, would you introduce staff and the consultants?
Thank you. With me today are Paul Holt, Director of Community Development and Planning, Ellen Cook, Principal Planner, and Tom Leininger, Senior Planner with the Planning Division. And I am Tammy Rosario, the Assistant Director of Community Development. Also joining with us today are our partners in this comprehensive plan update, our consultants, Vlad Gavrilovich and Todd Gordon from EPR PC, Leanne King from Clarion Associates, Julie Hurlins from Tischler Bice, and Bill Thomas from Michael Baker International.
Good. Well, welcome, everybody, and thank you, Tammy. Did you want to make an administrative comment about meeting minutes?
Yes, thank you very much. Minutes from the last two meetings were provided as part of today's packet. However, they weren't specifically listed on the agenda as required by our county's emergency resolution. Therefore, formal approval of the minutes will occur at the next Planning Commission Working Group meeting, but please share with us any comments that you might have on them so that we can make sure those are corrected for the next meeting. I note that there was a typo of the word that was intended to be bike in the meeting notes, and we've made that correction. And if there are any others, we'd be happy to make those as well.
Okay, thank you. And speaking of the continuity of government, everyone saw the resolution in the packet, and just in very brief summary, on April the 14th, 2020, the Board of Supervisors readopted the Continuity of Government Ordinance, which under certain circumstances permits this committee to conduct today's meeting by electronic or telephonic means without a quorum of members physically present. May I have a motion for adoption of the resolution in everyone's packet?
This is Ms. Leverins, so move.
Thank you, ma'am. And we'll do a roll call vote, Ms. Rosario, I believe.
Yes. Mr. O'Connor?
Aye.
Ms. Leverins?
Aye.
Mr. Haldeman?
Sorry. Aye.
Polster?
Aye.
Dr. Rose?
Aye.
Ms. Null?
Aye.
Mr. Kropp?
Aye.
And Ms. Wertman?
Aye.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Now, moving on, even though these meetings have not had a dedicated public comment period, we do afford the opportunity to the public to make comments either through emails or telephonically or other electronic means. Were there any citizen comments going into this meeting today?
No, there were not.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, now that all the housekeeping is out of the way, I'll turn it over to Ms. Rosario to move into the scenario modeling portion of the meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before we begin the presentations this evening and find ourselves knee-deep in the exciting details of the scenarios, performance indicators, MetroQuest survey, and goals questionnaire, I wanted to take a few minutes just to retrace where we started and where we are today. You can remember it was approximately a year and a half ago as staff, Planning Commission, and Board of Supervisors, we were drafting a priority list of what we'd like to accomplish in the Comprehensive Plan Update. At the top of that list were strategic plan items of conducting scenario planning and measuring the transportation, environment, community character, fiscal, and land use impacts of growth in the county, and using it to guide our decision making. Just over a year ago today, we were delighted to kick off our effort with the robust responses from our citizen survey and the engagement of services of EPR, Tischler Bice, Michael Baker International, and Clarion to assist us in this innovative effort to leverage scenario planning and the integrated modeling of land use, transportation, and fiscal modeling into our citizen engagement and our overall comprehensive plan considerations. So we, a year later, are about halfway through our 2-year process, and we've accomplished the assemblage of our community participation team. It's had 15 meetings and held a round of public engagement, and another one is very close to occurring in just a few weeks. We've had 5 meetings of our Planning Commission working group where we've worked through key issues, and we started to build the model. We have drafted the scenarios, and we've had 3 board check-ins along the way to apprise them of our progress. So we find ourselves today at a very exciting milestone of looking at the scenario narratives that we have built and seeing how they have resulted in different performance, resulted and achieved different results with our performance indicators. And so I'd like to turn the microphone over to Vlad Gavrilovich to lead the discussion on what that says for us and what we might glean from this and what we might carry to the public and receiving their input to guide us toward a preferred vision for James City County.
Thank you very much, Tammy. This is Vlad Gavrilovich with EPR, and I'm going to share screens and walk through the presentation now. As soon as you have given me that permission, I can share the screen. Okay. All right. Can everyone see this screen of the PowerPoint?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you again, Tammy, and thanks to all for your patience the past 3 or 4 months as we've been building these scenarios, hard at work with county staff and 3 different modeling teams to bring you these results today. I want to share some logistical points and some general pointers about what we're going to present today. First of all, we have about an hour to go through about 60 slides. So we're going to try and keep this at a fairly brisk pace. We have pauses, though, for your questions and comments between each of the different model results segments, the fiscal, the transportation, the land use. So different people are going to present these, and we're going to pause and get your comments. And we'd appreciate it if you could let us get through those slides for each segment before the questions. And it's pretty true that we won't get through all the questions today. We've already received some good input, comments on both the slides and the MetroQuest, but we're going to take diligent notes today. And one of the things we'd suggest is that any questions we don't get to, you email us, email to the staff rather, and we can compile all of these and respond to them in writing in the next week or so. And then secondly, a general thought or caveat about these results. We know you've had them for about a week and hopefully have had a chance to look through them. And as you know, it's very hard to predict the future. And what we're using the modeling for in a case like this is not to try and predict, but to inform our decision making. Modeling, land use modeling, is always what I call a very high altitude activity, meaning that it generalizes a lot of detail and a lot of content and blurs some of the details in order to let you see the big patterns inherent in the data. So that's important to keep in mind. Although your model, the county model here, is pretty unique in that it gets down to the parcel level. Most land use modeling does not. But this will be very useful for the leave behind model and kind of the ongoing planning work of the county. However, in the scenario testing phase, we need to keep this high altitude perspective in mind, despite the details that we have. There's a lot of factors that went into the allocation of growth and the modeling, which may lead to some surprising results on any given individual parcel. However, it's the overall pattern that's the key here. So we ask you to keep that big picture in mind as you look at these results. And we want to get your input and guidance on proceeding with these results to the assembly, which we'll touch on at the end of this presentation. So the overall outline here is an overview of the modeling, a look at the maps of the growth patterns of scenarios, and then we're going to have different folks present to you the different model results. Julie Herlins is going to present the fiscal facility model results, Bill Thomas, the travel demand model results, and I'll present the land use model results, and we'll have some conclusions from the planning team and then turn it back to you for additional comments. Now, briefly on the modeling overview, as you'll recall, this is an integrated set of 3 different models that feed information to each other to give a series of indicators for land use, transportation, fiscal, and facilities in the form of a set of charts that are performance indicators. These results in terms of indicators go into a round of public meetings, which is going to be the assembly in August. And most importantly, whatever the results of that are does not automatically become the future land use map of the county. Instead, the results of these public meetings and the preferred scenario from those will go to inform a new goals and policies framework that will then be the basis for the future land use map, the revised comprehensive plan. And out of that refined future land use map, we will be building the preferred scenario that goes into the leave behind models and is used for ongoing planning. And of course, out of that will be the implementation framework for the comprehensive plan. So the basic question to test in the scenario planning process is the implications of different land use and policy directions on the fiscal health, environmental quality, and quality of life in the county over the next 25 years. And we have 2 scenarios to test that. One is the trend, which is the current trends in land use and development projected out over 25 years. And the other is an alternative land use policy framework based primarily on public input over the next 25 years, a change of direction, if you will. Both of them use a common growth assumption to create a level playing field and see which of these scenarios best meets the county's vision and goals through the lens of the public input themes that we've received to date. The scenario narratives, there's a lot of detail here, but in a nutshell, the trend scenario projects current land use trends and development patterns continuing, including a relatively dispersed pattern of single-family developments, commercial retail centers. Some protection of the rural areas is encouraged, but there's going to be some development outside of the PSA in the rural areas, whereas the alternative scenario has greater protection for the rural lands, some limited development in them, but focus more on rural and agricultural uses outside the PSA. And there's more infill, redevelopment, mixed use, higher densities, and economic development inside the PSA in concert with existing community character. The control totals for growth used in the models you can see here. The current year, or 2018, growth totals were, or population employment totals were from the current county parcel records. The 2045 totals were from the regional model from the Hampton Roads Transportation Planning Organization. Important reminder that these numbers do not represent a goal or a target for growth. They're just picking a standard increment of growth to allow this scientific testing of alternative policies with the same growth totals under possible future conditions. Modeling overview, these are some of the details that you've seen before in our March presentation, but in summary, a lot of the transportation and fiscal facility model input comes from the land use modeling. So the land use modeling takes the future population employment, models that as growth. It does it through taking that overall control total of growth in terms of population employment and creating separate control totals for each place type that are based on the scenario narratives. For example, more single family, more development in the rural lands or less development, and then it uses these control totals to allocate people and jobs to parcels throughout the county according to each scenario. The public input themes, these 5 themes, derive from our input in the fall, and these were used as the lenses with which to analyze the scenarios. The scenario performance indicators, as you'll see, are categorized into each of these public input themes. So this is the overall growth pattern in each scenario, and you have gotten copies of this in your packets. You really need to blow these up to study them in detail, but some overall kind of observations here. So the gray dots are existing development. Each dot in these maps represents a person or a job. And one of the things you notice, first of all, is just how much of the area, particularly within the PSA, is already developed. A lot of the areas that are undeveloped are no-build areas, which we have built into the model, wetlands and water and sensitive areas and things like that. So within the areas that are remaining to be developed, you can notice that there's some general pattern of more development, more people and jobs within the rural lands in scenario A, the trend, than in scenario B. Scenario A also has more dispersion of growth within the PSA than scenario B, which is more compact. And also in terms of play types, which you can see in the charts below, scenario A has more single or low density residential, more commercial, particularly retail, whereas scenario B has more mixed use and some more medium and higher density housing types. There were also these detail maps that showed kind of a middle portion of the county blown up a little bit. And here you can also see kind of the pattern within the rural lands, which is to the left of the screens, showing more jobs or people in the rural lands in scenario A, the trend, than in scenario B, the alternative. There's also some of the dots in scenario B are jobs accounting for kind of rural agricultural economy uses being more prevalent in scenario B, whereas scenario A is just more population. And then also in scenario A, you can see there's a lot more of these yellow dots, which are the low density residential, red dots, which are commercial, primarily retail, whereas in B, there's more mixed use and medium higher density housing than in scenario A. So that's the general pattern of growth. Hopefully you can study these more and send us any comments, but this is really what was built into the land use model. And then these results numerically were taken into the fiscal facility and the travel demand models for their analysis. And I want to turn it to Julie Herlins. Julie, I will continue to manage the slides if you just tell me next slide, but she's going to share with you some of the results, and then we'll pause and take your questions.
Okay, great. Thank you, Vlad. Everyone can hear me? Okay. Good to be with you here this afternoon, and happy to present our findings thus far on the fiscal impact analysis. So next slide, please, Vlad. So just by way of introduction for our modeling and our approach. So this is a fiscal impact analysis. This is not a budget exercise. This is not to predict an end state. This is really meant to be a comparison between these two alternatives, as Vlad had indicated in the introduction. So we use, however, it is a specific, we do use specific figures, and it is a quantitative analysis. So we do have exact numbers that are input into our analysis and as outputs. So the scenario control totals in each of those two scenarios are used as inputs in our model. We are really, again, looking at comparisons between the two scenarios as opposed to the absolute dollar amounts. We're not looking to predict dollar figures at the end state. Our model is based on what we call a current level of service, and that current level of service is reflected in the latest current, the latest is when we started the current adopted budget. And so in this case, it was 2020's adopted budget. I should note in terms of the dollar amounts, we use current dollars. We do not include inflationary factors in our analysis throughout the process for a variety of reasons. The key here, not the least of which, is that different factors appreciate at different levels. And if we were to assume inflationary appreciation on the property value side, we would then also need to include inflationary factors on the expenditure side, and different pieces of the cost components inflate at different levels. And so by the time we get to the end, we'd have to unwind and sort of unravel each of those factors. So we really want to use a snapshot in time so we can enable those comparisons at the end state. We model all general fund expenditures, capital improvement projects, and I should say too that we model operations and capital separately. We're doing those separately, and it's not merely taking the CIP and entering those projects in. We're using the CIP as guidance to determine what kinds of projects are on the horizon, but we want to identify which portion of those capital projects are going to be triggered, or what types of capital projects and portions of those projects that are triggered between the two scenarios, as opposed to just entering in a facility that's going to be built regardless. We include the schools in our analysis, of course, both local and non-local revenues funding schools, and those costs as well that are captured within the school budget, and it's not just the county funded portion, so it's the total school fiscal picture. We do use fiscal analysis zones. I'll talk about that in a brief moment, but we want to model distinctions and variations across the county. So we do vary those by hour, and there are creations for this analysis, and we call them fiscal analysis zones. Public safety is modeled using some local data. We use calls for service data, and we can go into that in more detail if anyone would like to. And then we also use those fiscal analysis zones to model some of the infrastructure, schools to take advantage of where there's capacity in some places, fire and EMS to reflect different numbers of calls by stations, and some levels of parks that are not countywide parks. Again, and this probably will be the longest slide that I go through in terms of all of the laying out all of the assumptions. Our capital costs are assumed to be debt financed in the model, so that there is an initial cost and then principal and interest costs that go through over the time period that we're modeling. And I should note here on this bullet on the transportation capital costs, we had a couple iterations of this presentation. This this analysis and these findings do include the transportation capital costs. So I want to just make sure that that's amended. And so this iteration does include those transportation capital costs that are assumed to be funded by the county, and that is a portion of the total cost. So there is an assumption here of county-funded portion of major capacity projects. And then just in terms of the way that we show results, we have cumulative results. This is a 25-year fiscal model, so we aggregate all of those costs over that 25-year period, and revenues as well. And then we also show, we've called here a stabilized year, and that really is just that last year, just an annual number, an annual figure in that last year of the presentation, of the projection period. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, I mentioned the fiscal analysis zones. We wanted to be able to identify, vary, as I mentioned, property values. We wanted to be able to vary capital costs where there's capacity and where there's capacity needs. And we also wanted to make a distinction between inside and outside the PSA. And so what you're looking at here is again our boundaries for our analysis. They're not based in any other boundary, but again a creature of the modeling purposes here. And so we'll have a few more slides that kind of identify those distinctions throughout. Next slide, please. So here, just a snapshot of, again, the specific numbers that are used as our inputs, reflecting those two scenarios. And so there are, on the left-hand side of the screen, scenario 1 on the top portion, the residential units, housing units by our fiscal analysis zones. And then the bottom portion of that left-hand side, the non-residential square footage assumed over this 25-year period. And then on the right-hand side, scenario 2, the alternative future, the housing units assumed in each of the fiscal analysis zones, and the non-residential square footage assumed as well. Control totals are essentially the bottom line, particularly on the residential, really similar, but there are variations in the types of units, and this is what's going to drive the fiscal results, as well as the types of non-residential development that will also drive those fiscal results as well. Next slide, please. I mentioned using the fiscal analysis zones to vary property values. And you'll see here that we've really, we've rolled up those the land use types into major categories. So between single-family detached, single-family attached would be a townhouse, and multifamily units. And to the extent the data is available, we have varied those values across the county. The same on the non-residential side on a per square footage basis, and these are assessed and taxable values on the retail, office, industrial, and then assuming the other / institutional uses are tax exempt. And then another key data point utilized within the modeling to model school operations and capital costs is a student generation rate. And so these are, we worked with the county and this obtaining schools data to update the student generation rates, again, using these land use types, these residential housing unit types to derive a student generation rate. And so this is the demand off of housing units for a guaranteed seat, so a K through 12 seat, and again by type of housing unit and by grade level. And so we do model it to that level within the fiscal analysis zones to really, again, take advantage of where there are seats that are available and where there's capacity that's reached and where additional seats would be needed to accommodate growth in each of the scenarios. Excuse me. So as a snapshot, this is just kind of rounding that back out. These are the totals for the 25-year growth period. kind of repeating those the county-wide numbers, for both scenarios, and then the outputs there from those housing units, so the population that's derived, and then the enrollment from the county, from these county units. You'll see here there's a distinction or the difference between the two scenarios of fewer public school students in scenario 2, given the mix of the housing units, and the lower student generation rates for multifamily units. And then on the non-residential side, the square footage and the jobs that are generated out of that land use. And then the bottom line of, again, just a snapshot and piece of information of end state, cumulative property value from both residential and non-residential, and the grand total, given the mix of units or the mix of land use types in that scenario 2. The overall value is lower in scenario 2 than scenario 1. Again, this will lead to some of the fiscal results we're going to see. Next slide. The next series of slides are the summaries of those the performance indicators coming out of our fiscal analysis. And again, we're going to show results as a cumulative, which is this 25-year total, a stabilized year, which is just that last year, year 25, an annual net fiscal result, comparing revenues and costs, and then a snapshot of a factor, a revenue to cost factor, and then some more detail, and then ultimately employees, number of new county FTEs per 1,000 persons to get to a governance performance indicator, if you will. Next slide, please. So what you're looking at here is the first set of results, the cumulative 25-year net fiscal results. The blue shaded results are scenario 1, the green shaded results are scenario 2. And what you're looking at here in the first bar chart is the revenues generated compared to the second bar, which is expenditures, and the net fiscal results in the third bar. Now the green is low enough that almost looks like it's at 0, but it's not. It's at 10 million. So both of the scenarios generate positive fiscal results. So looking at all revenues combined, subtracting out those expenditures over the 25-year period, both are generating net fiscal positive results. We are showing an indicator with that check mark. That's essentially a more positive results. However, both are positive. Both scenarios are fiscally balanced, given the demand and the locations of the demand and the resulting costs, and both for operating and capital, and the revenue generated. Next slide, please. The next slide then is the stabilized year. So this is just year 25. Now, in some cases, some of the debt service has been paid off. If a debt was issued in year 1 and it was a 20-year debt, 20-year term, debt finance or debt service would be paid off in some cases. In other cases, it may not be. And so this is a rolling 25-year period. But both, again, at the end state. I don't like to call it build out. It's never really built out, but at this end state in year 25, that there is a net positive fiscal impact in both scenarios. And again, scenario 1 is slightly higher, and this is really a byproduct of the type and the type of growth and the property values assumed. There are more revenues as well as more costs in scenario 1 compared to scenario 2, and mathematically, the net result is slightly higher, given the higher levels commensurate on that first scenario. Next slide, please. So looking at this, a pure snapshot, a ratio of revenues to costs. The first set of figures is the cumulative totals. The second set, that's a stabilized year. And this is basically coverage. It could be expressed in a dollar amount or a percentage. And again, both scenarios generating positive net fiscal impacts. And both essentially, I would argue, a comparable result within each of these scenarios, with scenario 1 at a slightly higher net return, if you will. And you'll note here with the check mark shown as well, that kind of aligns with what the goal of economic resiliency, getting to a higher net return in that scenario. Next slide, please. So I mentioned we look at, or we model over a 25-year period. Scenario 1, again, or scenario A is the in blue, and scenario 2 is in the green, the alternative scenario. And that this is year over year, and kind of showing, we like to show these figures for a, to indicate sort of the lumpy nature of the analysis of when capital projects come online, when those initial costs are incurred. And then ultimately you'll see sort of, toward the end where revenues exceed expenditures. And I should note too, this is the bottom line, revenues minus expenditures year over year. And at the end of the day, or at the end, sort of toward the end of the projection period, again, as debt service is paid off, those results become even more positive. But there is some amount of a ramp-up period where revenues are not aggregated sufficiently, not in hand sufficiently to accommodate or to cover those expenditures. But over time, in the long run, there is sufficient revenue to cover those expenditures. And then this next slide kind of drills a little bit deeper into those findings. And what you're looking at here is the dotted line is the revenue projection compared to the lighter shaded area that is reflects operating costs over time, with layered on top of that in the darker blue and darker green capital expenditures. So in both cases, there is sufficient revenue to cover operating expenditures in each year. However, when you start to layer on those capital costs, there is a net deficit in those early years. And I should say too that this is not uncommon. This is it is not a uncommon finding in terms of those capital impacts, and hence the reason why a capital improvement program is typically not fully funded, and there are choices about those scarce resources as communities contemplate how to fund the capital program. And then the last indicator, I believe, is looking at the impact on staffing. What kind of operating impact do these demands on services and infrastructure? What does that look like in terms of staffing? So we do model as part of this, as part of our modeling, a part of our fiscal impact analysis, the numbers of new staff to accommodate this growth in each of the scenarios. And in this case, given the inputs on the two scenarios, that this second scenario, the alternative scenario, is a slightly more, if you will, efficient outcome with a fewer numbers of additional staff needed to accommodate the growth at hand. And so these are numbers of staff per 1,000 increase in population. Now, there's demand from both population and employment, but just as a way of a snapshot, as an indicator showing numbers of FTEs per 1,000 persons, net new, and scenario B, again, is a slightly better, more efficient result. So overall, the headline here is that both scenarios generate sufficient revenues to cover expenditures, which is positive news. And I mentioned too that in terms of the findings and the result, that scenario A it generates both higher revenues, but higher costs as well. And so the bottom line of higher overall net fiscal revenues is really because of the property mix assumed and the valuations assumed that go along with that property mix. Scenario B has lower costs overall, primarily because of fewer students being projected because of the land use mix. And so overall, it's does have a lower cost and cost savings in location-based facilities because of that. Both schools and fire stations are lower across the board than scenario A. And scenario B is slightly more efficient in terms of new county positions than scenario A, serving that same population, again, due to the impact from fewer facilities and the operating impacts that go along with those facilities.
Thank you, Julie. The reason Julie went first is because she has another meeting at 5, so we have some time to get some questions out to her. Turn it back to you, Mr. Chair.
Oh, thank you. I don't have the the participant screen up so that we can look at the hand raising icons, but this group is usually pretty good about not talking over one another. So I'll just open it up to my colleagues for questions or comments on the fiscal portion of the presentation that you just watched.
Yeah, this is Frank. In the chat, I've put in 2 questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Do you want to just summarize those briefly, Frank?
Oh,
Or does Julie have those questions?
yeah, I can see them. Oh, I can see them. I can respond, and EPA may want to respond as well from the first part if they can see it as well. And I just want to make sure I understand the first part of the question. The relationship. The question is, what is the relationship between the TAZ socioeconomic 2045 data and the fiscal analysis zone, and the TAZ socioeconomic data 2045 with scenario A map scenario growth pattern? Yeah, it is. Oh, we're still there. We just stopped sharing the screen. Okay. The question here, Mr. Polster, on the, you're asking about how the TAZ data was used to sort of populate the fiscal analysis zones. Is that?
Exactly.
Okay.
Because the 2045 data for those TAZ shows exactly where the households, vehicles, personnel, people, all of that would be. So I'm trying to understand that relationship of those projections,
Okay,
especially
sure.
in scenario A.
Sure. Yeah. So we essentially drew, created a map, a GIS layer, and pulled those projection data, those control total data into our fiscal analysis zones.
Okay. And so what generated then in scenario B then?
The same approach. We had control totals from the full detailed scenario analysis that then was aggregated into. So we had the lower level data that was aggregated up into the fiscal analysis zone. So it's just a larger, it's larger than a TAZ. It's smaller than the county-wide data.
Okay. So
hey, Julie, you had a slide on that, didn't you?
The data itself. Yeah, it was. The control totals by area, which was slide 17 in the full presentation.
And I can go back to that.
Yeah. Is that what you're referring to, Bill?
Yes.
The
control totals by FAZ.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. So this was built with the TAZ figures. I mean, with the underlying, the scenario control totals, those are rolled up into our sub areas, our FAZ areas.
Okay.
Keep in mind, though, that the control totals in the land use modeling were done by population and employment, and then they get changed when you have different assumptions about square footage or unit totals into the fiscal data.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's a conversion element for using a household size to convert population into housing units and to convert employment into non-residential square footage.
Okay, so So just as a clarification, is in your scenario A using the TAZ data and then doing the conversion then, how does it end up that the rural area is less or more than what the TAZ data is showing? You
Well,
show more individuals and more jobs in the rural area, and your population is less in scenario B. How did that happen?
I think you're maybe talking about this slide.
Right. And then the correspondence to your fiscal analysis figures with the number of households in the rural areas.
So there were different control totals plugged into the modeling for the rural land, which was essentially a place type, the rural residential place type, in scenario A and scenario B. And scenario A had more total population in the rural lands than scenario B. You notice that scenario B also has some employment. But this is by percentage, not by total. So it's purposely different in scenario A and B because scenario B is supposed to have less development in the rural lands.
And the question is how did that happen? Just because of the place types or some restriction on a policy?
Yeah, it was the way that the control totals were assigned to place types to match the scenario narratives. So that slide that had the scenario narratives kind of was the marching orders for how to design each scenario in the model.
Okay, the last question is do we now know how many more schools, fire departments, and FTEs for EMS and police based on the scenario data in this fiscal model?
Yes. So that is an output from our analysis, and I think the best way to do this is to follow up in a written. I do have a snapshot figure that shows that information for schools. It's done in seats. Fire stations, it is by station, and I do need to add. I can get you the breakdown on the FTEs, which I don't currently have a table in yet, but we can certainly follow that up and get you that specifics.
Thank you.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments?
I do see some others in the chat. Should I just go ahead and read those? Is that?
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, I see 4 in the chat now. Okay.
Yep.
Why don't we go with to Jack Haldeman?
Okay.
Since Frank just spoke. Okay. And then Ginny.
Can you see those on the screen, by the way? I'm trying to show the chat.
No, we cannot see that on the screen.
Yeah, I clicked on my chat icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and it brought up the comments.
I think for the public record, it would be great if whoever's answering the question could read it out loud for the.
I think that works. I think that works well. Yep.
Okay. I can read the next question from Mr. Halderman. The question is, you held population growth constant for the purpose of your analysis. Based on your experience with the different land uses likely produce different growth rates, and if so, which would produce the greater? So I may need some additional clarification on that last part.
Well, your analysis is based on the population growing from 70-something to 120-something over the measurement period. And in both alternative A and alternative B, exactly the same numbers. And I understand why you have to do that for apples to apples. But in real life, would that likely happen? Would both scenarios likely turn out the exact same population growth, or would one encourage more or less population growth? And if so, which one?
Right. So yeah, that's an interesting question, and thinking through in terms of, one of the, you're right in that we had control totals and and sort of smoothed out the growth over 25 years. So what's not part of this is a market analysis to indicate that potentially, all things being equal, if the economy was humming along, that single family units would maybe get well, I don't even want to say that. So, but hypothetically, a type of unit would get absorbed quicker versus others. So in our experience, kind of thinking about, we've worked in a lot of communities with a pent-up demand for before this last kind of multifamily boom, for a pent-up demand for multifamily development. And so the market really caught up with those types of units, and a lot of those products were brought to market and absorbed rather quickly. And then then there was a plateauing. And so, that has a potential fiscal impact in terms of those, those units coming online. But in this case, say that was a situation in this county, that would be fewer students, fewer need for capital facilities. And so potentially, that scenario B kind of pushed earlier. Potentially, again, all things being equal in a heavy market demand for single family units, that might accelerate that scenario A result. And I'm oversimplifying because it's not as cut and dry as sort of either or. But there is, but in the long run, in the grand scheme of things, partially because we do assume debt financing, so it does smooth those costs over time. That ultimately, I would expect to see similar types of results. I don't think there would be much, in terms of pace of growth. We're not talking big differences, significant differences in terms of pace. So it's sort of a lot of thoughts to answer that question, but it ultimately, I think the pacing and the assumptions over this 25-year period is reflective of the demands off of those. The timing kind of reflects those demands and wouldn't drastically potentially change results. Although again, there are if non-residential accelerated for whatever reason, that would have a different result as well. So it is based on assumptions and those assumptions that go into this analysis are going to get to those. Get to the results that we've identified.
Okay. Thank
Julie, do you want to see if you can get to some of these other ones before you have to go?
Sure. Yeah. No, and I apologize. I do have to be on another virtual presentation at 5:00. The two questions from Jenny Wortman.
I think I would have to take the first basis for changing the PSA. What is the basis for changing the PSA boundary in scenario B at the north end of the county? I probably will defer to staff a bit on that, but we did work with staff to the assumptions that in certain different growth patterns, according to the scenario narrative in B, would mean that the PSA would contract in 25 years. Tammy or Paul or anyone, anything to add to that?
I mean, we can probably come back to this one if we want to try to tackle the assumption on the more or less retail space or industrial before we lose Julie.
Sure. And that probably needs some more clarification unless you understand this one, Julie. More retail space in which scenario? The question is, why is there more retail space when we want higher paying professional jobs?
So this is Jenny. In the scenario B, we were supposed to be modeling the preferences that we heard from the public input, which was higher paying professional jobs rather than the kinds of lower paying retail and service jobs we have in the area. And your scenario B has more square feet devoted to retail and not nearly as, and adding, picking up Julie's question, Ms. Leverence's question, also less industrial space, which seems to go against what one of the objectives that we were trying to get to with scenario B.
So, Julie, again, this is more a land use issue probably, but you may want to add to this. The control totals were varied by population and jobs into these different place types. So it was, to answer your question, there were fewer jobs allocated to retail in scenario B than in A, and more jobs to these higher, I guess, economic development place types. However, when you convert those to square feet, it ends up being more square feet for retail. In a nutshell, it's the conversion between jobs and square feet. Is that fair to say, Julie?
Yeah, and I just was wondering if on the PowerPoint, if you go to, yeah, I don't have a split. I was going to think in that later slide if there was a split by type of employment, by type of job. But we can certainly follow up with that split as well. Overall, at scenario B is there's fewer square footage than scenario A, and again, this would be on the land use kind of converting those control totals back into the pieces, but we can certainly provide some more detail underlying those factors as well. It was not these were not drivers. They were not, the outputs from the land use scenario modeling become inputs into the fiscal analysis model. So we're not manipulating those inputs as we're doing as we're testing the fiscal impacts. But I understand the question, and we can certainly drill down into the what underneath those square footage numbers.
And then do you have time to address Ms. Leverance?
No, I think that was addressed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you've gotten all of yours responded to then. I'm sorry. Okay, good.
Yeah, I think having additional information on how that happened will be very helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then Mr. Polster, your question was answered earlier.
Yes, that's correct. I'm looking forward to the additional information that you said you would provide.
All right. Well, it looks like that's all of the questions on the fiscal portion of it. So
okay.
I will turn it back over to Mr. Gavillibrick.
Thanks, Mr. Croft. All right, I'm going to run the slides and turn it over to Bill Thomas and Michael Baker for the travel demand model summary.
Thank you, Vlad. So my approach here is going to generally tell you the findings or the general view of the travel demand analysis, and then show you the data that leads us to that. And so, what we're seeing in the travel demand analysis, and you heard it in the description of the land use scenarios, is that in alternative 2 or B, we have different types of housing. Less single family detached and more multifamily. And there's also more compact development. And both of those elements lead to less trips generated and shorter travel times, which result in a lower number of vehicle miles traveled and congestion within the county. So what we found is that generally the roadway level of service is better in scenario B, and there's a less of a need for capacity improvements. And so, Vlad, if you can advance the slide to the nature and environment performance indicators, we'll kind of go through what we saw that led us to believe what I just stated. And I wanted to preface I wanted to provide you that preamble because some of these measures are a function of, let's say, vehicle miles traveled, and one of those is CO2 auto emissions. Okay, so that's That's a function of vehicle miles traveled. Vehicle miles traveled are going down, and CO2 emissions are going down in scenario B. And so the next one on the right, roadway capacity improvements, I indicated there was less of a need for improvements in scenario B. And what we have here is a graph that shows the lane miles of improvement needed to maintain what we call a level of service C, which is approximately making sure that the capacity of the roadway system is that 70% of that is used up by demand and not higher. And so, as you can see, the freeways by and far take up the most need for capacity, and then we see that the arterials, and then finally the collectors. But in each instance, scenario B is requiring fewer improvements for capacity. Next slide. So community character. So one of the things we wanted to look at, what is the effect of truck traffic on really minor arterials, collectors, and local roads, more residential areas, and certainly we could all imagine that the more truck traffic, the less quality of life there is in those neighborhoods. And so what we're finding is it's very close. The scenarios, there's a little bit more truck traffic on residential roads in scenario B compared to scenario A, but not a great difference. And the amount to begin with is fairly small. So we really didn't see much change there. And on the right, just to echo what I said, that generally the roadway level of service is better. What we're doing here is we're looking at each type of facility. We have a range of facilities from interstate through minor collector to local. And what we looked at to kind of convey level of service is again, what is the volume to capacity ratio? So how much of the roadway capacity out there is being used up by demand? And, for each of the facility types, I believe, yes, that's true, is the scenario B, the volume to capacity ratio is less than that of scenario A. I guess the biggest difference we see is in the major arterials and the minor collectors. But in all cases, the level of service for scenario B is better than scenario A, which lines up with what we're seeing with less vehicle miles traveled, less congestion, and shorter travel time. So all of that seems to follow. Next slide, please. And I want to remind everyone, this is very important, and I had to remind myself just now to tell you, I didn't tell you at the outset, but these results are for an average weekday. Okay, so this is averaged out over an entire weekday, and certainly we acknowledge that things may differ in certain times of day, like an AM peak period or a PM peak period. But for right now, this is how we're presenting the indicators, as a first look into how we can characterize scenarios A and B in terms of, performance of the transportation infrastructure comparative to travel demand. So as I stated before, so we're at economic development, Vlad. Vehicle miles traveled on the left is less. And so then on the right, the middle to the right, we have something called accessibility. This is probably the most abstract measure that I'm presenting here today. And by that, it's hard to get a gut feeling for it. But, let me just say that the accessibility to high density employment areas and major tourist attractions is very close for both of the scenarios. So there's not much difference there. And so let me just qualitatively describe accessibility as a function of two things. It's first is, how arduous is it to make it to get to jobs or to get to tourist attractions? And you can think of that in terms of travel time. And then the second component is, well, gee, how many jobs are there really in these high density employment areas? and how much activity is in the tourist attraction. So what we can deduce a couple of things, and we verified this with the employment, is that everything I've showed you so far indicates that scenario B, that the network is performing better, there's less congestion, there's shorter travel times. So if the accessibility is about the same, what that's saying is while the network performance is improved, there are less jobs in these high density employment areas under scenario B compared to scenario A, for instance. And what that does is that basically washes out the differences in accessibility. So in each of the instances, we're really not seeing that to be a differentiator between the scenarios. Next slide, please. So quality of life. So we looked at the average speed of the transit serving roadway network, and it's in miles per hour, as you can see on the y-axis there. And so what we saw, and by the transit serving roadway network, what I mean are those roadways which serve as part of routes for the service plan, the bus service plan for, let's say, Williamsburg area transit. And what we saw, which is what we've largely seen going from scenario A to B, is that the level of service goes up for roadways, and what we're seeing here is a commensurate increase in the average daily speed on those roadways serving transit from about 35 miles an hour, I think that is, to about 40 miles an hour. So all of that makes perfect sense given the data I've shown you so far. Now one thing that we were scratching our heads about, and I just got this into Todd and Vlad, is that this graphic here is an error. There's a problem with the numbers we presented here, and what we would maybe kind of expect is maybe an increase in transit ridership due to an improvement in the speed of the roadway network serving bus routes. We need to correct this figure, but it may go either way, because while an improvement to speed of those roads that are serving bus routes would seem to indicate, oh, well, you'll be able to capture more folks taking transit. At the same time, as I said in the beginning, the housing mix that's in scenario B is generating less trips. So that may work the other way. So we need to revise the numbers in the transit ridership graphic, and I do apologize for that, but we knew that we needed to drill down into that one. And in fact, we did find some issues with the numbers that are being reported, and that will be corrected. Next slide, please. So more quality of life measures. And as I said from the beginning, one of the biggest stories here is changing countywide delay. Okay. And so, so scenario B is there's less delay, and that falls right in line with the story I've been telling you, that the transportation network is functioning better because we're generating less trips in scenario B, and people are traveling for shorter distances and times, and there's less congestion. And for those that don't know, what we call delay, well, that is the extra time you travel, and here it's in hours per weekday, which you may not be able to get a good gut feel for, but it's that extra time it takes you to travel because you're sitting in traffic and traveling slower than the posted speed limit, let's say, because of traffic congestion. Now, on the right side is another way to look at the effects of congestion, and it's an additional travel time as well, but it's a different kind of addition. In other words, it's not the extra time resulting in the slower speeds. It's the extra time someone builds into their trip to arrive on time because of the uncertainty of the travel conditions on the roadway, or the uncertainty of travel times. And travel time uncertainty generally increases with the level of congestion. So we can see that, it's fairly small to begin with. So what we're saying is that maybe about 4 to 5% of a person's normal travel time, they would build in that extra amount to arrive on time at their destination. And that goes down just a little bit for scenario B, which again is in line with, less delay, shorter travel times, less vehicle miles traveled. Next slide, please. Okay. So here we are at the average trip times, and I've been, saying shorter travel times, and here's the data, travel times in minutes for an average weekday by the kinds of different trips. And in the travel model that we're using, trip types are divided by the types of purposes. Why are people traveling? All the way to the left there, you can see that there are work trips, and you can see that there are trips that are not based on work travel. And we have these for the peak period of the day and the off-peak period of the day. But in every instance, we're seeing shorter travel times. And that is very likely due to the compact nature of the development associated with scenario B, as Vlad and others had mentioned. Next slide, please. And so here's a more visceral way of looking at the changes in travel conditions between scenario A and B. And what we're doing here is we're displaying graphically bottlenecks, okay? So scenario A is on the left, scenario B is on the right, and maybe a little bit difficult to follow. But if you, let's say, for instance, you look at that circle kind of in the center to the left in scenario A, you'll see a red line, and that's a roadway where the volume to capacity ratio is approaching 1, which means it's almost at capacity or exceeding capacity. So every one of these roadway links colored in red is experiencing some high demand, which is creating significant delay and producing some fairly low travel speeds. And if you look at the circle all the way to the south for scenario A on the left, you can see that there's a red line there. And just for comparison purposes, if you look at those two circles and go over to scenario B, you'll see that those bottlenecks are no longer there. And again, this is in line with the narrative that I've been carrying, that it indicates that the transportation system is functioning better in scenario B. Just to let you know, there are about 20 bottlenecks in scenario A, and there's about 15 bottlenecks in scenario B. And again, this is average weekday. So you can be assured that if on an average weekday basis, these sections of roadway are experiencing near capacity conditions, that these are the worst of the worst. If we looked at things at other times of day, there would probably be a different picture painted. But again, we're looking at things on an average weekday basis for now in order to convey kind of a high-level narrative of the performance of the transportation system. Next slide, please. And so the findings are what I've been, that I spoke to you about in my preamble, and that I've been emphasizing and re-emphasizing with respect to each of the pieces of data that I presented to you, and that, lower VMT in scenario B, shorter travel times, congestion bottlenecks, it's better for scenario B, relatively the same accessibility to employment. Transit ridership, I told you we need to rework those numbers. But the transit serving roadway network is performing better. So, and less need for capacity improvements in scenario B. And I believe that's my last slide, and I'd welcome questions. Just to let everyone know, I'm via an audio connection only, so someone's going to have to read me any questions that are transmitted via chat or otherwise.
Oh,
thank you, Bill.
I don't see any chat messages. Any comments or questions from the PCWG?
This is Jenny Wortman. May I ask one question real quick? Do
Sure.
the trip data, the slides say trips internal to James City County. Does that mean that any trip that originates, say, in York or in Williamsburg, is excluded from these data?
That is correct. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, that is correct. That this represents travel. This is a picture of how travel internal to James City County, how the transportation system is functioning with respect to that type of travel.
Thank you.
This is Rich. Can I follow on to Ginny's question? And I don't know if there's a way to address it, but York County recently has announced several major housing developments. There's one over on Lightfoot Road that's got quite a number of apartment units, and there's a couple other proposed residential developments. And we know that those occupants will be driving in and around James City County. Was there any sort of a factor that you could put in your modeling to account for that, or it's just all strictly looking at transportation originating in James City County?
We can report things in different ways. So we can account for the impact of, let's say, someone traveling from York into James City County. Now, I think there was another question there embedded in what you said, and that is, correct me if I'm wrong, are we accounting for certain land use developments in York? Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct. Yep.
And Vlad, I believe that's the answer is that we're assuming for York County whatever the HRTPO forecast revealed for 2045.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. I see.
So some of that growth would be built in.
Okay.
The effects would be the same in both alternatives, though, wouldn't it? Whatever the development is happening in York would affect alternative A the same as alternative B, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And as far as the land use assumptions outside James City County go, that's a constant in both scenarios. So that doesn't cloud any differential analysis we'd be doing with respect to land use assumptions between scenario A and scenario B.
Okay. Good point. Thanks, Jack. And I see Rob Rose had a question, and then Frank Polster.
Yeah, hi. My question is more of a process question. It seems like all these scenarios are based solely on transportation by vehicle, by automobile. And I'm wondering if it's possible to take into account how the different scenarios impact other modes of transportation. So if scenario B is more compact and more bike friendly, does that further change the discrepancy between scenario A and scenario B? And is that taken into account?
Good question.
Well, it is taken into account certainly on what I've reported today on the vehicle side, and as much as the regional travel model, which is the basis of our tool, can account for that. Now, I think I mentioned that the transit ridership numbers that we provided, that those are incorrect and those need to be corrected. So, we had a couple of measures in there that are trying to get at what you mentioned. The two measures were, how well, is the roadway supporting, the bus routes performing, and what is the change in transit ridership countywide, moving from scenario A to scenario B. So I do need to get back to you on the aspect of transit ridership.
But I think even at looking at sort of the goals for the different planning scenarios, one of them is to be more bike friendly and more walkable. And that doesn't seem to be included. And so does one of those scenarios lend itself to being a more bike friendly location? And if that's the case, how does that impact transportation? Because it would certainly cut down the number of cars that are on the road.
Yes, I mean, qualitatively, from the narratives, you would certainly believe, and Vlad, please jump in, that the scenario B is likely, being more compact, going to be more friendly to non-motorized modes. And some of that is reflected in the reduced amount of the vehicular trip generation that we are seeing. But the regional model does not per se provide direct outputs that allow us to see any changes in the non-motorized component of travel demand. That's a limitation of the tool we're working with.
We do have some walkability or potential walkability metrics in the land use, but you're right. The ability to model additional bike and ped trips or mode shift is limited by that travel demand model architecture.
Okay.
Is that another question?
Yeah, Frank Polster had a question.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned about this issue of the outside traffic. I mean, as I recall, with the housing survey that we did, or the study that we did, there's something like 17,000 folks on a daily basis that come into the county. And when you take a look at the richest point on the Lightfoot Road, is you have the TAZ data projected already for 2045 for both the Moortown and Lightfoot, and the levels of service of that thing are already busted. And so to tell me that in either scenario A or B, that stretch of the road is not impacted is a little disturbing to think that it isn't. The last one is that in your scenario B, you've got the development of Eastern State, but yet there's no projection about any of the impacts that Long Hill Road in that section from 199 forward would have. Is there a reason for that?
Well, Bill, then we may both have to answer those questions. I think that external traffic is counted in this model. So some of the metrics are about internal traffic, but its overall flows count external traffic. And the impact on a specific road would show up far more if you did peak period travel. And I think that's something that we're looking at now. And that may be what you're referring to, Mr. Polster, that it showed bottlenecks or heavy levels of congestion or whatever. It's probably peak period.
No, they were levels of service. And there's a study that was done not less than 4 years ago for that Moortown corridor. And now we're going to add more to it. So the level of service isn't going to get better, period. So I'm suspicious of having that area green. And the idea that we're going to have more growth in the peninsula. I mean, the historic triangle study that was done on the traffic that just got released here showed Centerville as a congested area, believe it or not.
Well, yeah, likely the reports you're referencing, they have looked at traffic conditions by time of day.
And this is Paul. I can confirm that. So, yeah, Mr. Polster, the one that TPO did, that was looking at AM and peak hour periods versus what Bill is showing in this presentation, which are the daily volume. So a little bit of a distinction there, and we can work to clarify that on some of the data disclaimers and the data sources as we move forward.
And let me make a clarification in that, just to pick up what Vlad was saying, is that some of the data I presented here represent trips internal to James City County, like the average trip times. Okay, the last graphic you saw before the map, and as well the accessibility measures. But the level of service measures and the other measures, they do represent all traffic on the roadways that are within the geographic boundaries of James City County, which includes traffic coming from outside to in and inside to out and through. So my apologies for that confusion.
And the last question on Eastern State, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, but TAZ would show, I mean, your model looks at the TAZs, and we did have a lot of mixed-use development on Eastern State site in scenario B, so that would be picked up in your model at the TAZ level and would show impact on roadways at this model scale. You know, an individual smaller road may not be picked up, but the bigger roads.
Yeah, everyone. Yeah, sure. And I forget myself, but everyone has to remind themselves that the results I presented here are average weekday, and we are, we're going to plumb some time of day information, but that's what we have today, as I indicated, and that's going to look a bit different than if you look at a PM peak period, let's say.
Okay, good. Any other questions or comments? All right, I guess we can move on to the next segment.
Thank you, and I'll try to respect the agenda and go through it briskly, but again, feel free to ask any questions or note them in the chat. So as before, we are organizing these according to the public input themes and the land use model indicators. And this one is nature and environment. So on the left, it's a measure of developed land, which is basically the impervious surface area that was developed. Scenario B showing quite a bit less developed area. And then similarly, the middle and the right, this is developed land by how much developed land is near prime agricultural areas or environmentally sensitive areas. Again, showing scenario B as having less development land near these sensitive areas. And then we also looked at developed land by watershed, and this is a measure of impervious surface area by watershed. You can see the majority of the watershed, scenario B, has less impervious surface, although there's a couple of them, Powhatan Creek and Diascun Creek, where scenario A is actually less developed land. And this is just a feature of how the growth allocation is laid out by watershed. On community character, primary measures here are density. So obviously scenario B had higher density residential types, so population density, average residential density, and somewhat less average single family density were higher in scenario B than A. We call this results without conclusions from public input, since people didn't necessarily in the input express a preference for density being higher or lower, but this is still an important one to share, I think, to get people's reactions to. On community character, also, we looked at impervious surface area on previously vacant land, which is areas that were vacant converted to development. On the left, scenario B had significantly less than A. And on the right is proximity of development to scenic or historic resources. And in this one, scenario A had actually less land that was near scenic or historic resources. We think one of the reasons for this is a lot of these features were in Williamsburg, in the city, the historic resources particularly, and where the growth is concentrated in scenario B ended up being a little closer to those than in scenario A, which is more dispersed throughout more rural parts of the county. On affordable housing, I know there's a lot of discussion that we could have about this, but essentially this model looked at the potential for affordable housing through place types and location of development. So here, for example, the number of units added to parcels considered developed, which was basically infill housing, on the left was much higher on scenario B. The population in place types that were more conducive to affordable housing, which is multifamily and single family attached housing, was much higher in scenario B. And then housing just near bus or walking networks within a quarter mile was higher in B than in A. Economic development, the primary land use indicators here were distance to jobs. The one on the left and the right are similar, and there are the distance to transit from jobs The one on the left was weighted by job density in each parcel, but they basically showed similar results for both scenarios. And then on the one on the right, jobs near points of interest from a county data set of points of interest. Scenario A was closer to, or had more parcels closer to points of interest, again, because of the relative dispersion of that growth in that scenario versus the more concentration of growth in scenario B. In terms of density, scenario A on the left had much lower density of jobs than scenario B. Jobs near high density employment areas was roughly equal on both. Again, that's a feature of the dispersion versus concentration of growth. The percent of jobs in mixed-use place types on the left was much higher in scenario B, and the average distance of parcels with jobs to existing employment centers was relatively equal, similar to the travel demand model results, being relatively equal between the scenarios in terms of accessibility to employment. And then on quality of life, housing near bus or walking networks was somewhat higher on the scenario B on the left. The distance to transit, the distance from residential parcels to transit stops, weighted by job density, was much better, if you will, so a shorter distance in the middle on scenario B. And the distance to parks was relatively equal between the scenarios. And all of these, keep in mind, are distance to existing features. So with the new growth, you would also need more parks, more wider expanded transit system. So we can't model those in this, but it's something to keep in mind. And finally, we showed on the right, population within walking distance of existing schools is relatively equal, but we try to include a measure of what about future school sites. So when you look at potential for walkable access to schools translated by the density of the parcels greater than 10 dwellings per acre density, it is much greater potential in scenario B for walk access to future school sites. So the findings from the land use modeling, scenario B obviously has a denser population and employment development patterns and more mixed use than scenario A. The more compact development pattern B also means that you have less acres of undeveloped land that are converted to development in B than in A, and subsequently greater protection from development for these environmental and agricultural sensitive resources in B than in A. And another result of the compactness of scenario B and the place types is increased options, at least for affordable housing. However, the more compact pattern of scenario B also means that not as many residents may be as close to some of these existing amenities and points of interest that you saw in some of these. However, the compactness of B allows future amenities to be sited more efficiently. So where future amenities are, could be more walkable and closer to that future growth. And then lastly, we wanted to conclude with some summary points that are from the planning team. Obviously, you as the planning commission and working group may have your own conclusions, but in general, scenario B has more results that conform to the public input received as what would be desirable for a preferred vision or direction for the county. Scenario A has a higher value of revenues to costs in 25 years, so more positive fiscal impact as a net, although both scenarios have a positive fiscal result. The growth in scenario B is geared more towards higher density housing and mixed use development than in scenario A. And scenario B has generally better environmental protection, affordable housing feasibility, and less traffic impacts than scenario A. And both scenarios have relatively equal access to existing facilities or amenities. However, more compact growth patterns in B may allow future facilities or amenities to be located more efficiently. So with that, we will turn it back to you, Mr. Chair. Any questions on this or the overall presentation? Actually, let me just get through the last couple of slides. I apologize.
Okay.
And then we can just leave it back to you for comments. Again, what we need from you is guidance specifically with proceeding with the public assembly and sharing these results with the public on August 10th, and a couple of other agenda items, the MetroQuest survey and the goals survey, to affirm those, and any other guidance on what questions we want to ask in those surveys for the public this summer. And next steps, in a couple of days, we will have a meeting with the CBT to review materials and your comments on these materials. Then on the 27th, there will be a dry run of the public assembly, which will occur on August 10th. It'll be designed as a webinar that will kick off the public input. The primary public input will be these two surveys, MetroQuest and Goals questionnaire, that will run for 3 weeks to receive input. And then after August, we will affirm the preferred scenario and begin drafting the comprehensive plan elements. I did have one more slide back to Tammy, which is where we were in the overall process before we turn it back to you.
Thank you. As I mentioned previously, this is a 2-year process, and we are approximately at the halfway point. We've been laying the foundation and listening to citizens and building these scenarios so that we can have data moving forward. But soon we'll be pivoting to testing out those the data and the scenarios and the results with the public so that we can start making some decisions. As a group, we'll be meeting to understand what the preferred scenario is from the citizens, and we'll be working toward adapting our, reviewing our policies and revising and adapting what we have in the comprehensive plan to help work toward meeting that preferred vision. So that come next year at this time, we will have worked through every chapter of the comprehensive plan. We will have had 3 rounds of public engagement, going from the highest level down to the implementation level, and we will have a draft document that has been presented along the way in parts to the public, to the Planning Commission Working Group, to the Planning Commission in full, and the Board of Supervisors. And it is our aim, and we believe we are on track to have an adopted plan ready for consideration in next summer.
Thank you, Tammy. I do see in the chat area there's a few questions that came up, and the first one was from Mr. Haldeman.
Sorry for my stammer there. Typing isn't one of my strong suits. I don't know what is anymore. How do you know where future schools are going to be located? And then it struck me as odd that since most existing schools are located within the PSA, that the walking distance between the 2 scenarios was basically equal. I would think it would be the schools would be much closer to housing under alternative B, but.
And before the answer comes out, Jack, I'm sorry, I should have said Tim O'Connor had to sign off due to another commitment. So Tim is no longer part of the conversation. Sorry, go ahead.
So we can talk about him, right?
We can, and we can put him on committees.
I can try to address your question, Mr. Hallman. So how do we know where future schools will be located? I think in the fiscal model, there is, in the fiscal analysis zones, there are assumptions about where schools will be needed. So we at least have them in that course geography of we need X number of schools in north, central, south, but we don't have specific school sites. So we couldn't model, walkability, for example, to future school sites. And then your second question, why would walking distance to schools be the same in both scenarios? If most schools are located within the PSA, I think that is a feature of the kind of spatial allocation of growth in the scenarios. So the scenario A is much more dispersed, and the schools are more dispersed. So you have more population that is closer to that dispersed pattern of schools. Whereas scenario B, you've got a lot more concentration. And I think although some schools may have great walkability with the new growth being concentrated, others would be in other parts of the county where we're not locating growth in scenario B. So it kind of comes out to be a wash between A and B being equally walkable.
Okay. Good answers. Thank you.
Good. Ms. Wertman, you had a question on affordable housing.
Thank you. Sorry, forgot to hit the unmute. I also want to tag on to Mr. Haldeman's question. So my first question is, are all of the multifamily and single family attached units considered to be affordable housing? And if not, what is affordable housing in this model? And then tagging on to Mr. Haldeman's question, I would think that the family composition that ended up in scenario B, if there are more multifamily houses and single family attached, would be different than the family composition in scenario A. And what have the implications for schools been taken account of in that respect? So those two questions.
To answer your second question first, yes, there are assumptions in the place types for household size and composition with the different place types. So low density residential or medium or high have different ones, and those do plug into not only the fiscal metrics, but also the travel demand metrics. So they have different trip generation rates. And then your general question about affordable housing, what this model really looks at is the potential for affordable housing. We have not modeled what would be affordable. What we have done is modeled place types, primarily single family and attached and high density residential place types that would have greater potential for affordability. It would be a different type of modeling exercise, I think, to actually plug in the costs of all the houses and relative to income levels and affordability. So it really is a potential for affordable housing that we're modeling.
Thank you for that, but just to one last question. In the property values, you had all of the multifamily housing property values equal across all of the zones. And that was the only kind of housing that was like that.
That's more a fiscal question, I think. I can go back to that slide, but I really don't know if the property values vary by fiscal analysis zone.
You can take it offline if you want. That would be okay.
Yeah, that might be one to put into writing, and we can get Julie to respond to you.
Thank you.
We have a question. The last question in the chat area is from Mr. Polster. And can you see that, Vlad?
Yes, I can read it.
Okay.
5 of the citizen survey questions show a significant gap between the following issues that citizens deem important and with which they are not satisfied. All are interwoven with population growth. How or to what extent would you tell citizens at the upcoming August 10th meeting that scenario B quantitatively reduces the gaps of these 5 significant gaps? Affordable housing, 33% gap. That's a satisfaction gap. Roads and highways, 24% satisfaction gap. Attracting jobs and businesses, 20% gap. Preserving rural character, 16% gap. And protecting environment, 15% gap. So a good kind of general question, if I'm understanding it right. I think that we could maybe, as we are preparing the presentation for August 10th, summarize some very big picture takeaways that relate to those satisfaction gaps. So scenario B has greater potential, for example, for addressing that affordable housing satisfaction gap without presupposing how we would implement it. Greater potential for preserving rural character and protecting the environment, for example, and better results in terms of roads and highway congestion. So we could provide a high-level summary if that gets at your question, Mr. Polster.
I think it's important as we move forward in trying to inform folks about the model in a different way, that we don't lose sight of what those gaps represented from both surveys. And so I think trying to boil this down to something that's understandable and communicating that is the reason why I asked that question. And if you can find a way to communicate that between the model and the potential, I think people will understand a lot more. I will.
I think that's a very good point, Frank. Yeah, that's if we could roll that into the August 10th session, I do think that would be helpful.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's a good segue actually to the MetroQuest, because that would be one of the ways that we would get input is through this survey. If you like, we can move to that agenda item.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions or comments, so the MetroQuest would probably be a good place to go.
Okay, and the other part of this is the community goals survey, which we don't have time to go through in the presentation, but that was in your packet that has been worked on by the CPT and staff and consultants. So appreciate any other comments on that on written form. So let me get to the MetroQuest. We're going to briefly share the draft MetroQuest survey, welcome any comments, but we're going to do it fairly quickly, again, respecting the agenda. Just a few notes on MetroQuest as a survey tool. It's a very powerful tool that lets folks respond both on a computer, on a smartphone, in a very visually interactive way. However, it has some limitations, as you'll see in this. It is set up as a series of pre-designed templates. When you go to the MetroQuest site, you can see, and I'm sorry, I may not be sharing the right screen. Can you all see this MetroQuest screen?
Yes,
I can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, good. It transferred to the right screen. Okay. When you go to the MetroQuest site, you can see that they have different templates that are kind of pre-wired, pre-designed templates. We've been working with Baker to fit our information into one or more of these templates. We've tried to get MetroQuest to customize them as much as they're able to, but we're also have some limits we're pushing up against. For example, they have strict limits on the size of images and how much text you can put in, mainly so it'll fit on a mobile device format. It has limits on the number of panels and slides per panel that you can do, and also in the layout of those slides, as you'll see in the draft. So we can wordsmith some of the text and swap out images, but we can't make these wholesale format changes. And the main thing we need from you is affirmation with any revisions, as we'll note, to proceed with the overall survey for the public assembly. And you can see here that we've maxed out on the number of these panels. There are 5 panels that you can do, and we have done a welcome panel and a wrap-up panel, and then the remaining 3 we have used to profile the scenarios in terms of maps, images, and numbers. On the welcome panel, there are 5 screens that you can do. They all have the same image, and they all have a 250 character limit on this one screen. This one text box. So we can change the wording, but we have kind of maxed out on how much information we can share. And then when you go to the map screen, so there is one panel or one portion of the slide that allows you to do a zoom-in map, and we've done that on the right. On the left, that is a static image with a limited amount of text. However, we can work on making that the font bigger or making this overall smaller so that it is more legible, particularly on a mobile phone. But you can see in this, you can go from one scenario to the other and zoom in and kind of explore that map to see how it looks. Again, one dot being a job or a person. And then when we go to the images panel, again, it's set up so that it's scenario A or B. And each one has the 5 public input themes and a series of images on each input theme. And it allows the respondents to rate each scenario and, most importantly, tell us why. We're hoping to get not only a numeric rating on the scenarios, but some good comments on each one of these public input themes about what they like and what they don't like. And finally, on the numbers, So we did work with MetroQuest to get the resolution as high as possible on this. We can share less information. We can't really share more information, but this is the summary charts and numbers that we've put into each of the 5 input themes here that allows people to not only rate, but also kind of actually, yeah, here it is, more about this. No, I'm sorry. This one does not allow them to provide why, although we can look into that. And then finally, on the wrap-up, this is the same set of questions that was asked in the first MetroQuest, so we can compare kind of respondents' characteristics across surveys, and then just some information that drives people to the website for more information. We are presuming, by the way, that people will have participated in the assembly or looked at a recording of the assembly and the presentations, so that they won't be going into this completely blind, but hopefully there's enough information here that even if they had missed that, they can understand what's going on and respond to the survey. So that's a whirlwind tour, and open it up to any comments or questions you have.
Thank you, Vlad. Any comments or questions?
When I went through this is Rob, I noticed on this first page, the page you're on now, those scrolling images with the text, it went so fast, like it was hard to read the text before it moved to the next one. And it might be useful to either trim the amount of text, or if you could slow the scroll down. Maybe I'm a slow reader, but I found it a little difficult.
Good point.
Too,
when I look at it, didn't automatically scroll, so that's something we will look at. Does it automatically scroll for you?
And one other comment, can you go to the map? Look at the maps. So on the map on the right, maybe this is me, I'm having trouble understanding your legend at the bottom, and it might just need a little more explanation. Like what the colors represent here, if they're sort of matched up, the colors, and then you have the colors along the bottom. So I don't know, maybe it was just me, but I found this to be a little confusing, what you were trying to get at here.
Okay, maybe we need a little more text narrative there to say what that legend says.
Yeah, I'll look at it again, but I don't know, I found it a bit confusing.
It's important to hear, kind of gut level responses to these.
Mr. Polster also had a question.
The first one is on the charts that are there. Without really being able to see the road network or names, it's sometimes very hard to relate to where those areas are. So, I mean, if somebody, you had to figure out that Eastern State was even in scenario B and what that meant and where that was. And so there's no frame of reference to these place types that people can say, oh, yeah, that's in my neighborhood, or that's what that is there. And it's part of being very hard to understand the legend that's in the upper right-hand corner within the bottom left percentages. So you keep on going back and forth between that, even to try to figure out where the place is. So it's almost, oh, okay, what is it telling me? Because I can't figure it out. Anyhow, putting that aside, on the Metro questions, and I understand what you've done with that, but one of the things that bothers me by saying, do you want a new goal? And I put this in writing earlier to you, is those goals are really high level to a lot of strategies in action that are in the 2035. I hope to God we don't throw those out, because there are things in there specifically that are guiding us in the as is, except you're going to move it over to the 2045 by putting more emphasis on mixed use, which we've had before, or affordable housing, or bike lanes and things of that sort. So when you're asking somebody to say, hey, do you want to rewrite the goal? rewriting it without understanding what the substantive strategies and actions, to me, is distorting if somebody comes in and says, we need to change this goal. Because they don't understand what that goal represents and how it, at least we've been talking about it for a number of years on how to implement those changes, which your land use model in B is showing. So I'll just leave that in terms of how you're trying to solicit input at a goal level.
Just a quick response to that. I think it's a very useful reminder, and that this is not the time when we're rewriting goals necessarily, because as the one flow chart showed before, we hope to use the scenario testing to inform refinements to the goal policy framework that includes strategies and actions. So we didn't want to put the cart before the horse and rewrite goals before we had reactions to the scenario testing. However, I think, and staff may want to add to this, but the reason for the goals questionnaire at this point was we have precious few opportunities to get public input, and this was an opportunity to at least get some big picture thumbs up, thumbs down, or assessment of the goals framework. And then we would take that and the scenario testing comments into that refinement exercise of the GSA's goal strategies actions.
Okay. Yes, I would concur with that. This is Tammy. In just thinking about the opportunity to drill down a bit and find information that might help us perhaps reword goals, but it may be more of a revision. But some of the data we yield may help us refine the strategies or the actions. We may find that they really carry over into those deeper levels. So, there's an opportunity for the big picture, and there's an opportunity for some of the finer grain in this one instance for this round that we have to get input. We do have just one more input opportunity planned at the end of the calendar year, and that's where we'll be able to really get to some more policy direction, strategies and action level discussion with engagement with citizens.
Emmy, thank you for that.
Thank you. And I see Ms. Wortman had a question also.
Yep, thank you. On the nature and environment image, could you go to that, please, Vlad? This first one, where it talks about mixed-use walkable communities, that's not what the picture appears to be.
That's a good point.
So it looks to me as though your scenario B description has gone with your scenario A picture.
Yes, that's a very good point. And we need to kind of test all these and make sure that they, I don't actually find the scenario A nature and environment description for that image on here. So we'll fix it.
So thank you. On the affordable housing, I'm really not sure what you want me to get out of this. Am I picking what I want affordable housing to look like? I'm just not sure here.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I get that scenario B has more multifamily stuff, and scenario A does not.
Yes.
But
is it more the images or the words that are kind of confusing?
I think it's that I'm not sure what the goal is here. I'm sorry if I'm being
point
dense.
well taken. No, gut level reactions are important, as I said, and we can rework the images and wording here. The goal, I think, is to show that what's showing up in the land use modeling, which is that there are more multifamily and attached housing in scenario B, which gives more opportunities for affordable housing.
Okay. And then on the charts, I have to say I was just, you cannot, without being able to read the legend, the y-axis, I really wonder about how reliable the responses will be if people don't really understand what they're assessing.
Yeah, one thing we did notice, you can zoom in both on the computer and on the mobile device.
Okay.
But I don't know if, that's going to be intuitive for people. So we could also provide fewer of these charts. There's an awful lot of charts here.
Yeah.
That might make them bigger.
I think I would err on the side of trying to find the ones that are most representative and make them more readable. I don't know if other people agree, but it was a lot to digest.
Mm-hmm. Good input.
Thank you.
Just to let everybody know, Barbara Null had to sign out for a previous commitment also, so she's no longer with us.
So we appreciate and apologize for the compressed time frame, but we appreciate your kind of first blush reactions to this. Would welcome any more detailed email comments. And as I said, we've got a dry run of this on June 27th, where we will have a new version of the MetroQuest and any other refinements to the charts that we would be presenting.
Okay. Thank you very much, Vlad. Did you have anything else other than that you wanted to add, Vlad or Tammy?
It would be great to get general affirmation, I think, for the record to proceed and to, with revisions noted, to start putting this into the August 10th assembly for the public.
Okay. So I guess I'll ask for a motion from the group, someone in the group, to say that preliminary affirmation is given for this, subject to the changes that were discussed, and they'll bring a revised version back. Any motion to that effect?
So moved, Jack Haldeman.
Thank you, sir.
That was the third time. I keep forgetting to unmute.
Thank you. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Okay. Opposed? All right. And I saw, Dr. Rose, you had a hand raised, but I assume it's from the last time, your question earlier.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Well, since we're approaching 6 o'clock then, if there's nothing else to discuss, I'd like to ask for a motion to adjourn to the August the 5th Planning Commission meeting at 6 p.m.
I'll move to adjourn.
Thank you. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Thank you all very much.